Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Prop 1 Grant Agreement Kickoff webinar. I'm Paul Murphy with the Groundwater Grant Program, and I'm here today with Megan Tosney, the Bonds Section Chief, and Apurjeet Ranji from the Groundwater Grant Program. We're going to be recording this webinar, so please turn off your cell phones and also mute your call-in phone. We'll be having breaks in the presentation where we will take questions, so if you have any questions, please hold them until the breaks. You know, we have a broad group of people here with a variety of different projects, but the purpose of this webinar is to be general in nature. So we'll be able to answer any specific issues or questions you have about your project after the webinar. The webinar is going to basically follow the contents found in the Project Director Guide, which is available on our website. We had sent out an email earlier this week for you to download a copy of that. So if you do have your Project Director Guide, please follow along since we will be referencing it throughout the presentation. So here's the agenda we have for today. We're going to talk about the roles and responsibilities of some key individuals that are associated with the execution of the agreement. Also talk about some due dates, and also we'll provide a brief overview on some of the general compliance deliverables associated with data collection and management. For reporting, there's several reports that are required in the grant agreement. We'll touch on those, such as progress reports and annual reports. And also we'll go over invoicing and any supporting documentation that's needed for reimbursement. And we'll finish up with what's needed to be in the auditable file and also any audit findings. So now we're just going to go over the roles and responsibilities of the grant manager, the program analyst, and the project director. These will be the three individuals that will be key to ensuring a proper implementation of the grant agreement. It's real important just to have open communication between these three folks, because open communication just always leads to a successful project. So I'll go into a few of the specific roles of each of these positions. So your project director's role is to maintain the schedule and keep the project on track. Like I said earlier, project director should be in constant contact or in contact quite a bit with the grant manager. Also, the project director is the only one who will be able to sign or prepare invoices or deliverables unless another person is outlined or added to the project director's certification. The project director ensures that the project is completed per the agreement and also develops and maintains financial management controls. One of the more important things is that the project director is responsible for maintaining auditable files for 36 years. We'll talk about that, as I mentioned, later on towards the end of the program. So the project director, like I said, could delegate work to a day-to-day grant contact. Now, the grant contact isn't allowed to sign any documents, such as invoices or scope change, or can they negotiate any budget line item changes. But the day-to-day contact can provide any additional clarification to the grant manager, such as information on schedules, deliverables, and field work. So the grant manager is the water board's main point of contact for the grantee. The grant manager reviews backup documentation and also reviews and comments on any of the approved deliverables. The grant manager also ensures that costs are aligned with this budget and the schedule. The grant manager can dispute invoices, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on when we talk about invoicing. Also, grant manager, we like to do site visits before, during, and after any field activities. The State Water Board's program analyst will review and process invoice. They also update the tracking expenditure spreadsheet and verify that the funding allocation is used. We have here on the slide that we ensure that reimbursement is not over 90%. We like to save 10% for the final invoice amount. So during the life of the project, the program analyst makes sure that reimbursement does not go over 90%. And they also prepare and process any amendments or extensions that may occur. So not all projects are going to have a technical advisory committee, but if you do, the technical advisory committee will consist of regulatory agencies that will provide input on the deliverables. This will be done through a series of meetings or a meeting with the TAC and the grant manager and the project director. So the recipient should address any comments the TAC has and then make the appropriate revisions prior to submitting final deliverable to the grant manager. Part of the TAC will have a memorandum of understanding or an MOU. The MOU will lay the groundwork for the technical advisory committee. It will identify the forum and process for the meetings where discussion and resolution of issues will be brought up for the project. We're going to have a template of an MOU on our website shortly. So there's important due dates that are in each grant agreement. All of them have the 6 that you see on the slide. So the start date is the date on which you can begin to incur costs for reimbursement. In most cases, this is the date of the preliminary award letter, the date that you receive the preliminary award letter. The execution date is the date that the deputy director signs the agreement. Now, this starts the clock on the deliverable table that's identified in the grant agreement. For estimated and critical due dates, these are the dates when the deliverables are due. With these, if you're always late in meeting the due dates, a breach of agreement or an amendment may be warranted. So it's important to really keep the lines of communication open with the grant manager to keep them updated on the project status so we could avoid these delays. The work completion date, I want to emphasize that the work completion date is not the same as the construction completion date. The work completion date is completion of all the work as described in the grant agreement. And this includes any post-construction, startup, or any monitoring. So the State Board will not reimburse any cost after this date. And the final invoice date is typically a month after the work completion date. And this allows the recipient time to process the final deliverables. And deliverables, so we'll now...
Wait for questions real quick, or do you have one coming soon?
No, we don't have one.
We'll just take a quick break to see if anybody has questions. Give Paul a second to breathe.
Yeah.
Okay, that's fine. Just wanted to take a quick check. Go ahead, Paul.
Okay. Okay, so now on to deliverables. Important thing with deliverables that all final deliverables must be submitted in electronic format and uploaded into our FAST tool, which is the Financial Assistance Application Submittal tool. Most of you should be familiar with FAST. The one thing that doesn't get uploaded into FAST is the invoices. They must be submitted with a wet signature. And we like it that you upload onto FAST on a regular basis and not all at once. So I want to cover some of the plans that are described or maybe described in your grant agreement. Most projects will have a monitoring and reporting plan, or an MRP. If your project includes any data collection, then an MRP will be required. And the MRP consists of three components: the MP, monitoring plan, the PAEP, which is the project assessment and evaluation plan. This will only be for implementation projects, and also the QAP, or Quality Assurance Project Plan. A QAP is for any project that includes data collection as part of the scope of work. So I'll go over both the MP, PAP, and QAP real briefly right now. So the monitoring plan should address both pre-construction and post-construction performance monitoring for the entire life of the project. The monitoring plan should also discuss the purpose of the project area, and the sampling methodology and procedures. Any groundwater monitoring data must be uploaded into GeoTracker. Your grant manager will provide instructions on how to upload data into GeoTracker shortly after the agreement is executed. And we'll talk a little bit more about GeoTracker later on. So the project assessment and evaluation plan is required for all implementation projects. It provides a framework to evaluate performance and monitor progress. And it also, some of the other goals are to improve current and future projects and also maximize the value of the state funds. We will also have a template of the PAEP up on our website shortly. And for a QAPP, like I said, it's only necessary if water quality monitoring is required in the grant agreement. If you don't have an existing QAP, we would like you to follow the US EPA guidelines when writing a QAP. We have a link that you may or may not be able to see on the slide. If you can't see it, just contact your grant manager and we'll provide you some information on where to get that EPA guidance. So for GeoTracker, for those of you who don't know, GeoTracker is the State Water Board's database that holds all of the water quality data. So all projects are required to upload data into GeoTracker. So the Technical Advisory Committee and the grant manager will determine either the time period and the monitoring locations that will be required for upload. And so, like I said, the grant manager will provide instruction documents on how to upload GeoTracker for a certain project. Okay, moving on to reporting. The next several slides will recover the reporting requirements that are found in the grant agreement. The progress reports, if you have your project director guide, you can find information on progress reports on page 67. Basically, the progress report tells the story of the invoice, so you need to provide enough detail to justify the expenditures. The progress report is submitted quarterly and should document the progression of the project, support the expenditures that are being invoiced, describe the work performed, and include any accomplishments and setbacks, and also describe any milestones that were met. With some of the other templates, we should have a template for the progress report posted on our website. You know, there may be a time during the project that the grant manager may require additional information or reports. These will be the as-needed reports. The recipient agrees to provide such reports during the term of the agreement. And a lot of times, some of this information may be needed to evaluate the funding program, or it may fulfill reporting requirements of the state or federal government. I want to emphasize that operational reports are only for implementation projects, and they're submitted throughout the useful life of the project, which is usually defined as 20 years. So these reports are for operation and groundwater monitoring data as defined in the Monitoring and Reporting Plan, or the MRP. You'll need to submit 4 operational reports per year, every quarter, for the first 5 years following completion of construction. And you should also submit an annual report within 45 days following the end of the 4th quarter of the useful life of the project. So for the first 5 years, you need to submit quarterly reports, and after 5 years, you just need to submit an annual report. So we'll pause now and take any questions that you may have.
What is usually the due dates for these quarterly and annual reports?
They're specified in the grant agreement. I think it's 45 days after the end of the quarter for the quarterly report.
Correct.
The final report due date will be specified in your deliverable table. It's usually relatively close to that work completion date that we mentioned at the beginning of the presentation.
Okay.
For projects that do not have construction, you're talking about operational quarterly reports for 5 years after the project is finished. For example, Paul, my project is destruction of well.
Right.
So that's all we do.
So we didn't include this requirement in your...
Right, so that's not required. It's mostly for groundwater cleanup projects.
Or prevention projects.
Yeah.
We do have a little discretion on that, but most implementation projects it's included.
Okay, because we do annual reports, we do biannual sampling, and so that's where all our monitoring wells are going to come in.
Mm-hmm.
So did you want us to submit that to you? Because that's normally submitted through our annual stakeholders anyway. Mm-hmm. So you won't be put on the list as receiving that?
I don't think it's necessary for that project. I mean, it's a pretty unique case, I would say. Yeah. But thank you for offering.
Anybody else have any other questions? If not, we will proceed with invoicing. So these will cover the last 2 items on the agenda. We'll cover invoicing and audits. So invoices are due 45 days following the end of the quarter. You can submit them earlier if you want. You don't have to wait the 45 days. And once the agreement is executed, your accounting department should be already working on the first invoice. Also, you should keep all lines of communication open with the grant manager, especially with respect to dates, schedules, and budgets, and the project status. Because if there's a delay in submitting an invoice, it could trigger a breach of agreement. So keep the grant manager always informed of what's going on with the project, especially when it comes to invoicing. So this slide shows invoice review timeline. So once the grantee gives the invoice to the grant manager and senior, they review it, then pass it on to the project analyst and fiscal unit, and then it goes through the State Water Board's accounting and bond coordinator. The last little slide last little mark on that slide, the SCO is the State Controller's office, and the State Controller pays the invoice. So our goal is to typically have this process done within 45 days from receipt of a complete invoice. Now moving on to supporting documentation. This is real important to have good supporting documentation so we can fall within that 45 days turnaround time. Information on supporting documentation can be found on page 68 of your project director's guide. I'll just go over these real quick what each one is. So The submittal summary sheet is a roll-up summary sheet for all the invoices submitted under the agreement. The receipts must be for work completed in the reporting period and be directly related to the scope. Some of the issues that we have arise with the labor certification form. These must include classification and hourly rates of your employees and also must match the approved list in the detailed budget. So you can't request a higher rate than the approved amount listed in the certification form, but you can request a lower rate. Also, you must be able to provide proof of the employer's billing rate. Progress reports, as mentioned earlier, must be detailed enough to justify the invoices submitted for both match and reimbursements. The progress reports, again, are the ones that tell the story of the invoice, so those are very important. Other supporting documentation may be some of the deliverables that are outlined in the grant agreement. They may be used as supporting documentation as well. So this slide shows an invoice template. This information on this template can be found on both pages 73 and 74 in the Project Director Guide. Our program analyst will send the invoice template to the grantee once the agreement is executed. So you must only use this file for invoicing. We won't accept any other files. Please don't make any changes to the yellow highlights in the template. And if we have to correct something on the invoice, make sure that it's updated on the next one. Again, only the project director or those listed on the project director certification can sign invoices and progress reports. One other thing with the invoices that we typically see problems are in cost carryover from previous invoices. If there is a cost carryover, just make sure that the amounts are accurate. An example of the summary sheet shown here is found on page 75 of the Project Director Guide. You'll notice an item number on the far left of the summary sheet. Now, this is the number for each piece of supporting documentation that you will be submitting. The comment section on the far right is very important too. Some invoices may not be fully reimbursable or eligible for match funds. So this is the column that you'll explain why you are claiming less than the full amount of the invoice. It's also where you may explain if a portion in the invoice is going towards match or whether it's paid for by another grant or fund that's not included in this project. You can also note if one single invoice is being split between different line item categories. So for this supporting documentation, the summary sheet, please make it easy as possible for someone like our program analyst or our grant manager who might not know about a lot of the details of your organization, to go through this supporting documentation. So, like I said, the labor certification form, this is found on page 79 of the Project Director Guide. So each column must be completely filled out to ensure processing of the invoice, and it must be signed by either the project director or those listed on the project director's certification. I want to point out that the labor certification is for grantee employees only. This does not apply to either subcontractors or consultants, just in-house work. So here are some of the common mistakes that we've seen people make on invoices. A lot of them are lack of supporting documentation and also incorrect calculations on the invoice. Like I said earlier, make sure the rollover amounts from one invoice to the next are done correctly. Progress reports are integral in reviewing the invoice. poorly written progress reports may result in an invoice dispute, which could delay payment. And for overhead and indirect charges, no receipts or invoices from consultants or contractors should list overhead, direct cost, or have an arbitrary multiplier.
Indirect costs.
Oh, did I say direct? Yeah, sorry, indirect. Direct costs are okay. Also, yeah, we encourage you to work with the contractor or consultant to eliminate those items that are on the invoicing, the overhead or indirect cost. You can roll those into a total.
What was that? Overhead?
Oh, so yeah, overhead or indirect cost or any multiplier are not allowed.
Well, just to clarify, you're saying that the contractors that we use, we can't have any line items that is overhead?
Correct. So what you could do, if you anticipate there's going to be overhead, you could just roll that in to a rate. It's just that we don't like to see those. If it's on the invoice, we won't be able to pay if it says overhead.
Got it. Okay.
But you can roll those into the rate for your subcontractor. Okay. Well, here's a couple of ineligible costs that we talked about. So any indirect costs or tuition fees, again, overhead is not eligible. You can't deduct any insurance, and food and beverages are not allowed either. Like I mentioned earlier, yeah, any markup fees from contractor or subcontractor are ineligible, so if you could roll those into a total, that would be okay. And we also won't pay for any legal fees or any cost of an audit.
Travel is okay. Then have to travel to the site.
Yeah, travel is okay as long as it's directly related to the project and you're supposed to follow all the state travel rules. And
so if there is an invoice dispute, our program analyst will send the dispute by email to the grantee. Now, our invoice process stops during invoice disputes. So the time required to address the dispute is up to the grantee. There have been instances where it's taken several months for the grantee to provide us the required information. And, if it's prolonged too long, that could result in a breach of an agreement. But typically, it takes us about 45 days to review or to resolve invoice dispute. That's just general time frame. Okay, so now we'll get into audible findings.
should we take a quick break for questions if anybody on the phone wants to chime in?
Yes. Can we go back to the invoice template? I
Sure.
see that there are 5 categories on there, and it's also represented in the supporting documentation. So basically in our budget, when we budget the dollar amount for each category, what if we incur charges above a specific category?
So we can do, the grant manager can approve, once you've explained the justification and how you're still going to be able to complete the project, a budget shift of up to 15% of the total project budget. Anything, once you've reached an amount higher than that as far as the budget shift, then a formal amendment would be required, which, is a more lengthy process and would have to go through approval of upper management and that sort of thing.
Okay.
I'm not sure how to jump in there. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. So this is Colin Close, City of Santa Rosa. sometimes what happens is there are costs that are incurred within a quarter, but a contractor's invoicing process takes a while, so we may not get that invoice until the following quarter. Is that what you're talking about in terms of rollover costs? Or I'm not really sure how to handle it, because it said receipts were only allowable during the quarter in which the costs were incurred. So I may not get them within 45 days after the end of the quarter. So how do I handle that?
So there's two parts to your question, I think. So the rollover, it's just referring to part of the invoice form is showing what has been dispersed to date on previous invoices. And so we're just referring to, making sure that that accurately reflects what was actually dispersed on the previous invoices.
That makes sense.
For your question about the delayed invoices, as a general rule, we want to encourage you guys to try to do whatever you can to get those in the quarter. At times there are exceptions to that, and Wendy, you can chime in if I'm overstepping my bounds here. But, if that occurs, we want you to really, really clearly note it for us in the documentation that you're submitting and sort of provide us with a clear certification that, none of these costs have been claimed in previous invoices, and so that, it's very clear to us what the circumstances are.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay.
The other question I had, when we were developing our grant application in close communication with the folks that are going to be working with us as we implement the grant from the state side, we made it clear that we do have city employees. I work in the water department. We have city employees in another department who provide engineering services to us, almost like an outside consulting firm. Their costs are out of our control. So in other words, there's a labor charge, there's also an overhead charge, and sometimes there's another sort of indirect charge that is completely out of our control. So when we asked them, how do we budget for this in our budget, they said to basically include all of those costs. And so, if the hourly rate for somebody was $100, we may end up paying $250 for an hour of that employee's time. I'm not sure if that's actually going to be allowable based on what we've just seen you talk about with the certification of employees and their hourly and not having overhead or indirect costs.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because it was something I wanted to add a note about actually, which is that the auditors do scrutinize the labor rates of the grantees' staff a lot more than they do those of the subs. And so, typically you are only going to be allowed to claim the actual direct costs. It can include like fringe costs, for example, but if there's any indirect cost there, that's definitely going to be cause for an audit finding. So, Wendy, is there anything else that we should say about that?
Yeah, if they are wanting to collect those charges that they're considering indirect, we may not consider those charges indirect. I mean, it costs people money to implement these projects. So work with your grant manager and your analyst, and we'll figure out if some of those charges we can reimburse you, but it just will not be rolled into your hourly rate. It will be a subcategory, different line item.
Okay, that makes sense. Great. And then, I had one more, and I'm sorry, it's eluding me at the moment. Oh, I know. If we do want to submit an invoice in the middle of a quarter, we typically don't. We typically stick with the quarterly system. It's less work for us in the long run. We've got the funds to be able to sort of pre-fund this program and then do a reimbursement basis. But if for some reason it's the middle of the quarter and we want to submit an invoice, do we also submit a sibling progress report, sort of a sub-progress report with that is then rolled up into the final quarterly report, or how does that work? Because I know progress reports every quarter, invoices can be more frequently, but they also need a progress report. So what's the relationship there?
Well, I mean, generally for these programs, we are looking to see them quarterly rather than more frequently.
Okay.
The invoices themselves, which may vary from other State Water Board programs.
There was a slide that said folks could submit more often than that. We probably won't, but that's just it popped up.
I think what that was referring to was that you don't necessarily have to wait 45 days after the end of the quarter to submit. You can submit them sooner. But as far as the frequency, I think we pretty much stick to quarterly.
Great. Thank you.
Okay.
I think that's all I had for now.
Okay. Anyone else on the phone with questions?
Okay. So the last few slides will cover findings of audits. So unsupported expenditures and for match, they tend to happen when the contractor or consultant, the invoices are not detailed enough. So make sure you keep backup documentation for these expenditures. For inadequate fiscal controls, this is not having source documents that support the expenditures. For example, not having receipts for travel or not having timesheets that validate expenditures. With regard to the lack of compliance, the description in the deliverable table must match the deliverables received. If it's not clear, that could lead to an auditable file. Some of the other findings, basically subcontractor invoices were for work out of scope and also outside the terms of the grant agreement, and also the payments would exceed the contracted rate. Again, lack of detail for subcontractor invoices could lead to a finding, and we've even seen wrong project names in multiple projects on an invoice. So again, pay attention to details for that. A couple of the last ones here are the match requirements were not being met. So the match amounts must satisfy the match requirements that are listed in the agreement. And also the state does not pay for any nonprofits or any other third-party entities. So that's it for the presentation. Any other questions?
Yes, Paul, I have a question regarding the sub-invoices. So we do have some control over our internal tracking of employees, but as far as the invoices from the subcontractors, how much details do you need on that?
Wendy?
Yeah, okay. You're going to roll your sub costs up, and you're not going to send us the subcontractor's detail like you would if you're the grantee. However, we ask you to make sure that your subcontractors know of the requirement. The auditors have the ability to go see them. So make sure that they're keeping track of their costs the same that you're keeping track of your costs. Just make sure that they're aware that they should have timesheets for their employees. They should be able to back up the costs that they're charging you. Now, It's not very often an auditor will go to a subcontractor, so it's very, very rare, but it's a possibility. So we like to tell them, make sure that you have your documentation. You may not have to submit it to us, but you need to keep it in-house.
Okay. Now, in addition to that, so the actual invoice that the subcontractor sends to us for payment, do you need specific details on that invoice itself?
I think I'm going to let Tech answer this. They tend to want a little more detail than we had in the past. So go ahead. Sorry.
Well, I mean, I don't think that we necessarily need to see like a breakdown of hours and rates per, individual person, but it's nice for us to be able to at least understand what tasks were worked on and the amount of money that was incurred towards a given task if they're working on multiple things. I don't know if there's more.
And also like a project title. I mean, a lot of times we have seen there's invoices from subcontractors and it doesn't have a project title on it, so it will be nice to know which project this invoice belongs to, in addition to the breakdown of the task, like Megan mentioned.
Okay. So as long as they kind of identify like the work done and completed and the amount of hours and the dollar amount, that should be sufficient.
Yeah.
Okay.
So this is Colin. I have a question for you. I know we need to have a 36-year file that's stored somewhere. Is this hard copies you want stored somewhere, or is this electronic copies, and do you have any format or recommendations, or is that something I should look to the project director file for?
So that is totally up to the grantee in whatever format they want to store the information. So it could be floppy disks, it could be CDs, it could be USBs, or it could be hard copies. So we'll leave it up to the grantee to decide how they want to store all the files.
Just as long as it's easily accessible if an auditor shows up.
Right. And then in terms of the match, if we end up with more matching funds than we had promised, do we still continue to report matching funds even if we have gone over and above what was required?
Yeah,
usually I think it's good for you to, go ahead, Megan, I don't want
to.
to.
No, you go ahead, Wendy.
I encourage them to show that. It's a total project we're looking for, so we may not scrutinize those costs as much as we would something that's required in our agreement. However, it's not a bad thing to keep submitting and just to get a picture of the total project. And also, sometimes in the end, we find out that some of the match costs we allowed were not eligible, and then we have an easy way to identify additional match costs that you could include.
Great. And then I had accidentally fallen off the call, and I jumped back in as you were talking about the subcontractor invoices, and I understand we don't need to submit those with our invoices, but that they should comply with all of the rules that have been laid out. Is there a sort of a sample invoice or a list of what you want on those invoices? Because I can provide that to our main contractor to make sure that they oversee the subcontractors invoicing correctly.
Well, I mean, we don't have a template, but if you have concerns about, what's in the content of an invoice and you want to send like a draft version to your grant manager to take a look and let you know if there's anything that's concerning, we can do that.
But you don't have, say, just sort of a checkoff list of make sure invoices include A, B, C, D.
No, not really.
Okay, thanks.
It's a good idea, though.
Yeah.
Question related to the overmatch. Once we submit that, I mean, if we're a grantee that would like to apply for an implementation grant, are those declared as matched? Or can we roll those over as we would a implementation?
Wendy, did you hear that question?
Yeah, can they be, if they're doing a planning grant, can they use that match for the implementation?
Right. I mean, they can, but I guess there'll have to be a way of sort of formalizing that cutoff point, right?
Yes, we'll have to say that this was submitted as overmatch, but is actually in the scope of work for the implementation. Because, it's going to have to be included in the scope for the implementation grant if we're going to allow that match to be considered for it.
Right.
Right. We don't want to, make it a wash for the planning and then we can't claim it later.
Mm-hmm.
It depends on the task. I mean, just because you're overmatched in something that was in your planning grant doesn't mean you can necessarily apply it to your implementation, unless it's in that scope of work.
But I guess that's the question is that problematic if we duplicate a task in the construction agreement for the purposes of letting them claim overmatch?
Yeah, we haven't really done that in the past. I guess we would just have to make sure that it was very clear that it wasn't considered part of match for the planning.
Right.
At the same time, it's going to be the same task in two agreements, which may get auditors a little squirrely. Mm-hmm. If you're going to do some sort of pre-planning report and you're going to say you did it in your planning agreement, but you're also putting it as a task for I don't know that would be okay.
Right, and that's why, at the beginning, you want to try to be thoughtful with the budget that you're, if there's tasks that you may not need as match on this agreement, you may want to leave it out of the budget right now so that you could claim it more easily later, Yeah.
We haven't had that question before.
I was thinking ahead. I like it. Any other?
I think in the last workshop, you did mention that we can't claim hours back till I think September of 14.
November of 2014 for match.
November 14th, got it.
Yeah, that's for match only, but direct costs, you can use the date of the preliminary award letter.
It would be the start date of your agreement.
Or, yeah. Okay, a lot of times on our projects, it's the preliminary award letter. But
yeah, if it happens to end up being that date, that's fine, but it's actually the start date on your agreement for dollars, reimbursed dollars.
I have a question over the telephone. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, does the quarterly progress report requirement apply to the planning grants?
Yes, it does.
It does. Okay, all right. And also, what's the reason for keeping the project data records for up to 30 years? The feds only require 3 years.
It has to do with the term of the bond that's funding these projects, and essentially, there's the possibility that someone may want to come and audit your records over the course of the term of that bond, and so we have to ask you to keep them for that period of time.
Okay,
yeah,
all right.
Usually, bond gets paid within that time frame. So, legislature decided, that's 36 years. So, hence they put that 36-year requirement. Keeping the auditable files.
Okay, great. Okay, all right. So, okay, just I want to double check.
That would mean that us as the grantee would have to make sure that our subcontractors submit their detailed records to us, so that we have that available just in case it gets audited within that 36 years.
Yeah, understood. Good. Right.
Well, I mean,
I was asking for clarification.
I don't think we're expecting that. So, say for the example, the more detailed backup, like their timesheets, we're not expecting you guys to keep that in your files.
Yeah. Okay.
Should we require
for your subs, for your own staff, of course, you should have that available because that's the type of thing an auditor might ask you for. But for your subs or your contractors, I don't think that's the expectation.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay.
DOS, when they go out and audit, they usually do it 3 to 5 years from the time the grant is closed. So they wouldn't expect your subcontractors to hold anything longer than that. This is strictly for the treasurer's office and the bond sale. And it only applies to the grantees as far as I know.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Well, if that's it, thank you everybody for joining, and you can see on our slides if you have any questions, there's our website up there, and also our groundwater quality funding inbox. So if you have any questions.
Or you can work directly with your grant manager.
Hi, really quick. Were you going to talk about GeoTracker, or was that it?
At this point, we have some draft instructions that your grant manager could provide to you now, if that would be helpful to give you guys a little bit more sense of what's coming. Our intent is to provide those more detailed instructions to everybody within a couple weeks after execution of their grant agreement. But if you have more specific questions that you want answered now, your grant manager can definitely help you.
Okay, so just to be clear, just go to the grant manager about GeoTracker.
Sorry, what was that? I didn't hear you.
You're saying just go to the grant manager for specific questions about
your grant manager. They should have more information, what kind of formatting is needed to upload data to GeoTracker, and what's the project boundaries, how many sampling locations, sampling wells, that kind of information. So they will have more detailed information, for data upload on GeoTracker.
It's a little bit project specific, I guess, is why we didn't want to get into it too much today. But yeah, your grant manager can help you with that.
Okay.
Thank
you.
Sure.
I'm assuming the grant manager can also help us find the best way to get the audio recording of this and the slides as well? Or is that the link that's on this last slide here? Is that the best place to get those?
So we are recording the webinar right now. So as soon as the webinar is finished, we'll do a web request and post the recording on our web page. Once that's done, I can send an email that the recording is posted.
If you wouldn't mind including the link, I don't know why, but I tend to stumble around on the state site, and I'm not super efficient at navigating it.
You're not the first.
Oh, good.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
Provide a direct link so that all you have to do is
great.
just click on it. So.
Yeah, much appreciated. Thank you.
No problem.
This was very helpful. Thank you for this webinar.
Can I ask a question? And we probably missed it, but it was about the tax. Did you cover that?
Yeah.
Is that reimbursable?
Yes.
Okay.
Well,
I mean,
your staff time. Yeah.
But I mean, some of the agencies that we've worked with in the past, like GW, they make us pay. They'll invoice us their time, even though we're not in.
So we can't reimburse for DDW staff time as part of your grant agreement budget. I think in most cases we've been working with staff there and they're pretty aware of this need and you shouldn't have any trouble, but, if something becomes a significant issue, you can let us know and we can figure out, how to work it out. Any other last questions before we sign off? Okay. Thanks, everybody.